Welcome to a new Bible study series. With this lesson, we'll begin a new series entitled, How Does It All End? There are various names for these kinds of studies. You might have heard of the term eschatology or end times or something of that nature. But we're going to spend some time together in the Scripture looking to see what God says about how everything comes to an end. So the topics will include such things as, when does the end happen? What are the signs? What about the rapture? What about the tribulation? Is there a millennial reign? What happens on Judgment Day? What happens to the earth? Will the earth be completely destroyed, or will it be renewed? Will we live in some sort of new earthly paradise like Adam and Eve lived in Eden? Or is it going to be in a more spiritual heavenly realm? There are a lot of really interesting questions that we're going to explore together. I do want to offer a word of encouragement. I'm going to do my best not to get down in the weeds too far where we lose track of the reason why the Bible gives us information. It is a fascinating thing to try to answer some of these questions, but right out of the gate, we need to admit that whatever or whenever we're having this conversation, that we're going to pretty quickly get to the limitation of Scripture, because once you move outside of time, once you move outside of the universe as we know it or as we experience it, then sort of all bets are off as far as human ability to reason. So, for example, a quick example would be, is there really gold on the streets of heaven? Well, that's a spiritual place described by John using human language, and so it's unlikely you're going to want to go to heaven and break off a chunk of the street, take it to the bank, and invest it. So we'll point out those kinds of things, and we'll try to notice those kinds of things. The other thing that we sometimes can get distracted when we get into end times, it's almost like we start looking for secret knowledge, or like the secret decoder ring that'll unravel or open up things to us, and we'll have special knowledge about the when, and we'll address that probably in the very next lesson. But the real emphasis, it seems, that the Bible is giving to us, and certainly Jesus talks about, it's really not about the when, it's about who. It's not about knowing when it happens, but it's about knowing who the Lord is, so that whenever that time comes, we are assured and are excited, and it is a time of celebration rather than despair or fear. So that will always be the theme that we will look for, is how this encourages us. Even if we spent a lot of time, as sometimes can happen, well, this is exactly what this figure means in this prophecy and that back then and then now and in the future, we can kind of lose track of, this is about living in Jesus, so that whenever, however, and whatever, it's all good. So really, we could probably go with a better title, so much of how does it all end, when probably typical cultural interest is when does it all end. We're going to talk about how it all ends, and really, we should be talking about why it all ends, or even in whom. So in the process of those subjects, we'll take it sort of on a topical basis. Like I said, the Judgment Day, the rapture, the tribulation, the resurrection, all those sorts of interesting topics. But that will take us into a lot of different scriptures. And so we're going to be in the book of Daniel, in the book of Ezekiel, the minor prophets. We'll certainly be in Revelation. We'll be in the Gospels. We'll be in some of Paul's writings. And so it won't quite be a book study. And so we'll point that out and sort of issue a warning from time to time that we're looking at certain blocks and not the entire book or the entire context. So we'll do what we can to go through the scriptures and pursue this most interesting topic and keep things balanced as the Lord would intend. So I invite you to open your Bibles as we begin this conversation in Matthew chapter 24. I'll do my best to be honest with you about my biases and kind of where I'm coming from, because our perspective is certainly going to influence how we understand symbolic scriptures. We're not talking about the black and white scriptures, the thus saith the Lord, or 2 + 2 is 4, but more of some of the images and some of the analogies that we'll get into in some of the apocalyptical type of literature, or the figurative kind of language that we run into in some of these conversations. So let me tell you from the beginning that Matthew chapter 24 is my guide star. It is the standard that I use when I'm having this conversation or I'm studying any other scriptures. This is for me the standard that all other interpretations are measured against. Now, the reason why I say that is, for example, if you were to say the same thing about a particular chapter, let's say in Revelation or maybe one of the later chapters of Daniel, when you're in a lot of figurative language, that's pretty challenging to nail it down or to be real clear about it has to be this and nothing else. So I would prefer, and I believe it's wise, to use those scriptures that are much more literal to help us understand some that seems to be a little more figurative versus trying to do things the other way around. So in Matthew chapter 24, we're in the Gospels. Jesus himself is talking as recorded by Matthew, and we'll get some of the parallels. We'll consider Luke as well as he records this same conversation. And what's really helpful about this chapter is that Jesus is actually answering a direct question from the disciples. And so the things that are said, the principles, the theme, the overarching truth here is going to help us understand many, many things. Let me show you an example. So deep in Matthew chapter 24, we'll get to it in time, but we'll ricochet off of it in this lesson just to give you that example. So we could really spend a lot of time, there's folks who do, looking at certain numbers in the Old Testament, looking at expressions in some of the prophets, taking some pieces maybe from Isaiah and Ezekiel, a little bit of Daniel, and trying to figure and then add some things, and all of with the interest of when is the end going to come. There's been a couple times in my lifetime already that I have seen that sort of take hold. Sort of goes along with the idea of disasters. I mean, you have the man-made kind of thing, the Y2K, when we hit 2000, all the computers crash. That may be ruining our day, but that doesn't mean it's the end of the universe. Could even be a blessing in some cases. But there was the end of the Mayan calendar, and that probably meant the end of time. But even then, that wasn't from a theological kind of perspective. That was just, you got the Mayan calendar, and it must mean something. The first time I remember it was in 1988, and there were some folks that were looking at signs and numbers and filling in verses and saying that all this meant, and I don't remember the month. It had to have been in early May because of the connection that I had with it. And so it was advertised, it was 1988, here's the end, here's the reasons why, here's the verses. And of course, this is not 1988, this is 2023, so obviously somebody is swinging a miss, right? The reason we were kind of halfway excited about that possibility is that particular date was the date of our Greek final for second year Greek when I was in college. And so we were obviously really hoping the Lord would come and spare us from such judgment. Turns out he didn't come. Turns out we had to have the final, and our instructor even said, you know, y'all obviously missed the rapture and the judgment, so you are the sinners that remain, so here's your test. We didn't have the guts to say, aren't you here too? We just took our test and tried to survive. So when you spend a lot of time trying to think of, okay, here's the when, here's the date, the first thing we got to ask is why? I mean, there's curiosity. Okay, that's fine. But other than that, what difference does it make when it comes, as far as needing to know a particular date? The only one I can think of is, well, so that way you can get your house in order. It's sort of like, do you want to be told? Would you want God to give you, or through a doctor or medical science, whatever, to give you the date of your expiration? Like when you buy food, best to buy on this date, expiration date. Do you want an expiration date? Do you want to know? Well, kind of, but no. So to spend a lot of energy and a lot of fussing and potentially discredit oneself or the use of scriptures to try to find a date when, okay, so it's 100 years from now. Well, that doesn't do me any good because we all have our own end, right? We're all going to die sooner or later, and so we're all going to have our own end. So that's really what we need to be prepared for. So in chapter 24, verse 42, Jesus gives us the reason for this teaching, the reason that he's answering the disciples' question, and then thus the reason why the Bible talks about end times or how does it all end. He says in verse 42, it's the big therefore. So based on this whole conversation, which we'll back up and explore together, but therefore be on the alert, for you do not know which day your Lord is coming. So the reason to have this study is to be prepared, to be alert, so that when the end comes, we're ready, not so that we can be on the alert and get things right at the end, but rather we live in a way where we are prepared. And he uses the example of how a thief breaks into the house when no one knows he's coming. Verse 44, for this reason you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour when you do not think he will. Now that's what Jesus says, which means if I spend a lot of time with, okay, here's the date, here's the time, then it would be at odds with what Jesus said. He said he won't come when you think he will. So the argument could have been made in whatever that date was in early May of 1988, that was the one day for sure we knew that he wasn't coming because that was the day that people thought he would. You'll notice in verse 36, Jesus says, but of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone. For the coming of the Son of Man will be just like the days of Noah, and he'll talk about how it's a surprise, as he mentions in verse 42. So it seems to me that what Jesus is saying is that no one on earth knows, angels don't know, and that he didn't even know in the flesh. Now, what that sounds to me like is, as soon as I try to make a claim, this is when Jesus comes, that I'm claiming knowledge that even Jesus didn't have upon the earth. That seems to be misguided, at the least, to claim to have more knowledge about the Father's will and purposes than Jesus did. That's not something I'd be real comfortable with. So the emphasis won't be on trying to find the when, but rather building a relationship with the who, that is Jesus Christ, so that whenever the end comes and how it does, it's a day of celebration. It's the best thing that's ever happened to us versus the worst imaginable calamity that could ever be conceived. Okay, so let's go back to the first of the chapter, and we'll get just a little bit down this road. So Matthew 24 is, for me, the guide star to this entire conversation. So whatever I'm going to see in the book of Daniel, whatever I might understand from Ezekiel or from Revelation or from the Gospel of Luke or any other application, obviously it has to fit with what Jesus says. Truth always is compatible with truth. If there's some kind of disconnect, some kind of jar, some kind of disagreement, I've got something wrong. So in Matthew chapter 24, here's how this whole conversation starts. In the opening verse, Jesus comes out of the temple. This is toward the end of his ministry. His betrayal, arrest, and crucifixion and resurrection is looming. He's just had a big conversation in Jerusalem. He's just in the last few verses of chapter 23 lamented over Jerusalem because of their rejection and the price that they will pay because of that, the consequences of that. So he's coming out of the temple, verse 1 of chapter 24. He's going away when his disciples came up to point out the temple buildings to him. Jewish pride, not necessarily in an ugly way, but this is their identity. It's the temple. It's where they worship God in the various feasts that are required. It's where the priests serve. It's where the sacrifices are made. It is their centerpiece where God's presence dwells among his people. I mean, God's the one that told them to build it. So this is a big deal in a way that I think most of us probably can't imagine. There's just so much identity connection for the Jews. Now, as they're standing there, this temple's being rebuilt. Unfortunately, since Solomon's original temple, the thing has been torn down and rebuilt several times because the first thing that invading armies do is tear down the temple because it is a part of the Jews' identity. So when the disciples point out the temple to Jesus, Herod is currently remodeling and reconstructing and building on to the temple and has been doing so for several decades. So this is a long process, and it will continue for several more decades. So they point out the temple, and he says, "Do you not see all these things?" Well, there's the first hint that he doesn't see things the way they do. "Do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you that not one stone here will be left upon another which will not be torn down." Buzzkill, where the Jews would have been like, "Isn't this nice? Someday it's going to be amazing. Imagine when this is done," or whatever they might have specifically been saying about it. Whatever positive things they're saying, Jesus goes, "Yeah, well, you see all this? Well, it's all going to be destroyed." Okay. So one, that's not something they would have expected. But again, from the Jewish identity perspective, this would have been shocking because what do you do without a temple? Just like the Jews today who have rejected Jesus and insist on continuing to be Jews, you cannot fulfill the law without the temple. Where do you have the sacrifices for sin? How do you gather for the required feasts of the Old Testament or the law? You can't do any of those things without the temple. Well, we know from history that in AD 70, Rome is going to come and they're going to sack Jerusalem, they're going to put down the rebellion, and they're going to destroy the temple. And that's going to create several interesting shockwaves in Judaism. Way back in Matthew chapter 3, Jesus talked about, or John the Baptist rather, talked about the axe being laid at the root of the trees for those who say we are Jews, that we are Abraham's descendants. Already John's talking about that day is going to pass when it's not going to matter whether you're related to Abraham if you carry his DNA or not. It's going to be about our faith and our walk with the Lord. Well, the only way you can be a Jew, let me back up. So the only way, as I've already said, the only way that you can practice Judaism or keep the law is if you have a temple. The only way that you can be a Jew, the only way you can be a Jew is if you are a literal DNA descendant of Abraham. Now, you can be a proselyte, that's something else. But to be a Jew, you have to be born in the lineage of Abraham. Well, the genealogical records, the family records of the Jews were kept in the temple. So when the temple is destroyed, not only do you not have the ability to keep the law in many important facets, but number two, you no longer have any proof whether or not you're related to Abraham. That poofs, that goes away, that disappears. So that will leave the Jews unanchored. It will leave them adrift in their ability to continue in the old law, which sure seems like the wisdom of God, as John was prophesying in Matthew 3 about the axe laid at the root of the trees, that he's moving them away from, making it clear this is not about Abraham, this is about Jesus. Well, one of the interesting things that Jesus says is that not one stone will be left upon another, which is a pretty interesting and very specific statement to make. Because if an invading army is going to come in and they're going to tear up your city, they're going to knock a hole in the wall. That's how they're going to come in. They might knock a few more holes in the wall so that it can't keep you safe anymore. And you're going to burn various buildings. You're going to break into things. You're going to break down doors. You're going to knock holes in walls. Even if you took the time to collapse a building, and remember, they're not going to have a B-52 with bombers. They're not going to have the explosive charges to just demolish a building. They can't put a bunch of sticks of TNT, push the handle, and then collapse the building. They're going to do this by hand. You're talking about battering rams. You're talking about sledgehammers. You're talking about a whole lot of work. There's no reason to do that. If you've killed everybody in the town and you've knocked a few holes in the walls and you've burned everything that can burn, call it destroyed, good enough. But to take the time to not only demolish a building, but to separate every single stone is ridiculous. It's completely unneeded. It's completely unnecessary. There's no reason to do that. So Jesus saying something this specific as a promise in a prophecy is amazing. Well, it turns out when the Romans did sack Rome and when they did destroy the temple, that they were looking for riches and just assumed the Jews had a tremendous amount of gold that was hidden. And as you read the history, Jerusalem was in siege for a number of months, and so the inhabitants of Jerusalem quite literally were starving to death. And so by the time the Romans come in, everything of any value, they've had plenty of time to hide it, they've had plenty of time to eat whatever they could find to eat, and so on. So somehow or other, apparently a rumor got started among the Romans that the Jews had hid their treasures in between the stones in carved out voids in the walls. Well, they didn't find any treasure, so that must be what it is. It must be hidden, and so the Romans set about separating every stone looking for the treasure, fulfilling exactly what Jesus said would happen, which is really out of the norm. For sure, when Jesus says this, however, it's a message to the disciples that not only, you see this temple you're all excited about, the one you're impressed with, and all the glitz and how this is, our identity. It's going away. It's going to be destroyed. It's going to be completely destroyed. It's not like a fresh coat of paint and everything's fine. I mean, it's gone. Reduced literally to a pile of rubble. And then over the years, the stones have been moved and used in other parts of the construction around the city. And so you don't even have a pile of stones there. Interestingly enough, as a side note, God has allowed the Islams to build a mosque on the temple foundation, which has been there now over 1,000 years, which has further complicated things for the Jews because they can't even rebuild the temple because there's a mosque in the way. So they're going to have to get rid of that by going into that kind of war. And so it's interesting how God has not only allowed the temple to be destroyed, which it has been several times before and has been rebuilt several times, but this time he allowed something to be built on it, which is a pretty effective roadblock for any reconstruction or rebuilding it. As Israel becomes a nation after World War II, that would have been an excellent time for a temple to be rebuilt, but they're set the mosque, blocking that, almost as if God knew that was coming, and he's keeping the message very clear that it's not about Abraham, it's about Jesus. So a shocking answer, to say the least, one that would have blown their hair back, raised their eyebrows, and given them something to ponder like, how can this be? It has happened in their history before, and it comes with great judgments like Babylon coming or those kinds of things in the Old Testament. Well, obviously it's something that stays on their mind, because in verse 3, as he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, and they said, "Tell us, when will these things happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" Now, depending on how you read this and where you allow the commas or the pauses to be in the sentence, the disciples are asking a question that has 2 or 3 parts. When will these things happen? What will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? 3 different phrases are used. Now, I think it's fair to assume that the disciples probably thought they were asking one question in 3 different ways. Given how we've seen them struggle with Jesus is going to establish a physical kingdom and it's all about that, you could see where it seems reasonable that they could think, well, if that's happening, then it's all over, because that's the only reason why God would allow that. Because of the space of history, because you and I live almost 2,000 years after the Roman destruction of the temple, we know, in fact, there's at least 2 parts. That is, there's the destruction of the temple and the end of time. So when they ask the question, tell us, when will these things happen? Well, these refers to the previous sentence, that is in verse 2, that when one stone will not be left upon another, that the temple will be completely destroyed. So we can then insert, their question is, when will the temple be destroyed, and when is your coming in the end of all things, or all time, end of the age? So finally, we're going to reduce this to a 2-part question, because we'll see as we work through the chapter that when Jesus comes again, it's the end. They assumed all 3 were the same. What we know, because of the space of history, we know there's the destruction of the temple and the end of all things. Jesus' coming brings final judgment, end of all times. And we'll explore that as we go along the way. But let's work with that assumption for now. 2-part question: the destruction of Jerusalem, which involves the temple, and the end of all things, or final judgment, or Jesus' second return. 2 things. So they ask him that, and of course, they don't have the historical perspective we do, and they're certainly amazed the temple could be destroyed. And so Jesus begins to answer. So remember, Jesus is always answering a 2-part question. Maybe it was 1 part in their mind, don't know, but we know that it's a 2-part question, certainly because of the space of history. So Jesus answered and said, "See to it that no one misleads you." Isn't that interesting? They want to know about end things, and the first thing Jesus says is, don't be misled. Now, why? Keep that in mind as we go along in the chapter, and you'll see again why this is a touchstone passage for me for this conversation. Because if he's saying, don't let somebody mislead you on exactly when it's going to be, don't misunderstand the dates, don't misread the numbers. But what he said in the chapter is, it's about being ready. That's why he doesn't want us to be misled. That's the point and the theme that Jesus gives us in verse 45 when he says, Who then is the faithful and sensible slave whom his master put in charge of his household to give them at their proper time? Blessed is that slave whom his master finds so doing when he comes. So the point is, be a faithful servant. That's how he ends this conversation in the final paragraph of the chapter. It's about serving faithfully so that whenever the end comes, we're faithfully serving. So the first thing he says is, don't be misled. So don't get off of, in any way, any idea that would move us away from serving faithfully no matter what. That seems to be his major point. See to it that no one misleads you. For many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will mislead many. You will be hearing of wars and rumors of wars. See that you're not frightened, for those things must take place. That is not yet the end. There were, even before Jesus, there were afterwards. Gamaliel talks about that in the book of Acts in about chapter 4, about how there's one who went out in the wilderness and claimed to be the Messiah. That happens shortly thereafter, after Jesus ascends into heaven. And it certainly happened many times since. There's the group that went to South America and drank the Kool-Aid. There's the Waco, Texas, David Koresh. There's been and continues to be those who would claim to be the Christ. So he warns them, don't let somebody claim that and mislead you. And then he talks about when you hear about wars and rumors of wars, don't let that frighten you. Not because wars aren't frightening, but whether or not a war means it's the end of all things. Even in recent modern history, World War I was called the Great War because with it was an understanding it would be the war that would end all wars. Sadly, it did not. But at least in modern history, it's the first time that many nations around the world got involved in that war, and there were people who said, obviously, this is the end. And then the same kind of thing was said in World War II, and it seems like every time there's some kind of war or serious disturbance or conflict or problem in the Middle East, it creates the same kind of, this must be the end. What Jesus says to them has been borne out in history, in the space of history, because how many wars have happened since Jesus said this? Or in the last 2,000 years, how many wars has there been? I haven't taken the time to research it. I just know there's a lot, right? We can think of a half a dozen pretty quickly between World War I and World War II, just that we're involved in as America. We've got the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812. We've got the Civil War. We got World War I, World War II. We've got Vietnam. We've got Korea. We've got Desert Storm. We've got Enduring Freedom, I think was the name of it. We've got Afghanistan. You got all kinds of places where people are trying to kill each other. So Jesus says, don't let that frighten you in the sense of, oh no, this is the end of all things. He goes on to say in verse 7, for nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, and in various places there will be famines and earthquakes. But all these things are merely the beginning of birth pangs. See, if you're talking about being frightened, it's an interesting image, because especially if you're talking to new parents expecting their first baby, is all the Braxton Hicks, or are you in labor, or you're not in labor. Boy, that's all high energy, because, oh no, I'm in pain, and oh no, do I get the suitcase, do I get the car going? Because you don't want to have the baby in the living room, right, or in the car on the way to the hospital. So there's all this excitement in trying to understand, what does this mean? Is this a sign? Should we go to the hospital or what? So Jesus paints a picture that we're probably familiar with, that sometimes religious folk can get all kind of, oh no, and kind of get in that panic like a new expectant father running around in the living room screaming and hollering because his wife is in pain and they don't know if it's the true, sure enough, labor baby's coming or what. So the first thing Jesus says is don't be frightened, because this kind of stuff, he says, is normal. It is sadly the consequences of living in a broken world. We're going to continue to have war because mankind is going to continue to want to poke sticks in each other's eyes. That's our broken nature. Number two, there are going to be famines and earthquakes. There's going to be unstable and unsettled weather because the world has also been damaged. The world also is broken. Not only were Adam and Eve kicked out of Eden, and God said, now you'll work the fields by the sweat of your brow, and it'll yield thorns and thistles. So that's a dramatic change in the ecology of the world because of sin. If that weren't enough, the flood would have had a drastic effect on global weather. You want to talk about climate change, a global flood would dramatically change the climate in all kinds of evidential and unimaginable ways. So we don't live on the same planet that God created. Well, the planet's not in the same condition as it was when God created it for Adam and Eve. So broken people will do damaging things, and a broken created order will also do damaging things. So wars, famines, earthquakes. So you got man-made disasters and natural, what we call natural disasters, hurricanes, tornadoes, wildfires, drought, all those things is going to continue to happen. In Jesus' day, he promised there'd be earthquakes and famines and such, and we experience it even now. We could take a little sidebar here. I'll just mention this for a thought project, but there are numerous times throughout the Old Testament where God says that he will bless or punish those who are faithful or those who are rebellious. And that includes the weather. So, for example, God gave the vision to Pharaoh and gave Joseph the ability to interpret it, that there would be 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of famine. That's pretty tremendous weather change. 7 years of plenty is going to mean lots of rain at the right time, cool temperatures, all that sort of stuff. And then 7 years of drought means no rain. So that's a dramatic change in the weather. And it will be, in that case, we know, specifically to move Isaac or Israel and the brothers, so Jacob and his sons, from the land of Canaan down into Egypt for their time of sojourn, where Joseph would be able to protect them as the right-hand man to Pharaoh. So God moves the migration of Abraham's descendants in fulfillment of the promise and moves them back to the promised land. And the way he does that, the tool he uses is the weather. God is the master of all things. When Jesus stilled the storm, the disciples said, "Who is this that even the wind and the sea obey his voice?" So God is going to work in man-made disasters. He's going to allow the brokenness of humanity to bring about his purposes, and he's going to allow and work in the brokenness of the created order or the universe to bring about his purposes. So Jesus says, look, I'm telling you this ahead of time. This is how life is going to be on planet Earth. So if we're in the middle of a war, it's bad, and it could bring our own personal end. But a war, even in our home country, that's bad. It's dark. It's evil. But that doesn't mean necessarily that that's the end of all things. It may be the end of our nation. It may be the end of this culture. It may be the end of these people. But that isn't necessarily the sign of the end of all things. Jesus' message is one of faith, of confidence, of don't be frightened, don't be worried. It's all going to be okay. Let me just mention the next part of the first of the next paragraph. In verse 9, he says, "Then they will deliver you to tribulation." So one of the things we'll discuss in our next lesson is the Great Tribulation or the tribulation. It's pretty common. It's a common idea among what's called evangelicals, which is kind of a word for non-Catholics who follow Jesus and try to make the Bible their standard. Mind you, it's a really broad term, but most of our friends that we have are going to have some kind of view of a tribulation, some special period time of sufferings, things get really evil, things go bad, and so on. And then depending on who you're talking to, they're either post-millennial or premillennial, and what that means is there's going to be a rapture before or after, and maybe a 1,000-year reign on earth. You might have heard some of these ideas. We'll work through them. But the idea of tribulation, let me just give you this real quick. He says, then they will deliver you to tribulation. He doesn't say the tribulation. He says tribulation. But we'll kind of hang on that word. So flip over to John chapter 10. John chapter 10. And Jesus talks about tribulation in this case. John 16, I'm not sure why I was thinking John 10. So John, the Gospel of John, chapter 16, he's talking about what he's going to endure and how he's not going to be with them. And so the disciples, verse 20, oh, you're speaking in plain speech. We believe that you came from God. Verse 31, Jesus answered, do you now believe? Behold, an hour is coming and has already come for you to be scattered each to his own home and to leave me alone. And yet I'm not alone because the Father is with me. Listen to verse 33. These things I have spoken to you so that in me you may have peace. In the world you have tribulation. But take courage, I have overcome the world. So let's talk about that in the next lesson. Is there a tribulation scene peace? Or is he talking about, like the wars and the famines, that's how it is. There's always going to be tribulation. So we'll talk more about the terms of premillennial, postmillennial, and I'm going to tell you right now, I'm a panmillennial. I learned that word a long time ago. I really appreciate, because normally you're talking about, is the rapture before the tribulation, after tribulation, how's the 1,000-year reign work? What I like about being a panmillennial is I believe that if we're in Jesus Christ, it'll all pan out in the end. It's going to be just fine. And that, I believe, we'll be able to see clearly is the message and the point Jesus makes in Matthew chapter 24. So will there be a tribulation? We'll see. We'll talk about that in the very next lesson.